AM Best recently conducted a survey in conjunction with the Professional Liability Underwriting Society of the Society's members on the impacts of the pandemic on the professional liability insurance segment. I'm John Weber for AM Best TV. Here to discuss the report is Sridhar Manyem, Director, Industry Research and Analytics, and David Blades, Associate Director, Industry Research and Analytics, both of AM Best.
Just as a background, AM Best partnered with PLUS, which is the Professional Liability Underwriters Society. And we sent a survey out to all the PLUS members, and we got close to 100 responses, and from a very diverse set of people. It included agents, underwriters, brokers, executives, so on and so forth. So it was a really good survey for us to get into the minds of the industry to figure out what the impact of the pandemic was and on different lines, and how they are seeing these lines prospectively. So just wanted to lay that out. And most of our findings and insights were a combination of AM Best's superior analytics and industry knowledge, along with very useful insights that were gathered from the PLUS survey. So just wanted to lay that out.
For those that may not know, what lines comprise the professional liability segment, and how were these lines faring heading into the pandemic?
John, in general, professional liability insurance protects professionals such as, you say accountants, attorneys, physicians, and many others against negligence and other claims that are brought against them by their clients. These and other types of professionals have an expertise, particular expertise in a particular area that needs this type of insurance, because general liability policies do not offer protection arising out of business or professional practices such as negligence, malpractice, or misrepresentation. So depending on the type of professional person that's involved, professional liability insurance can be referred to as errors or omissions insurance. For professionals such as, let's say, real estate or insurance agents, professional liability policies are usually written on a claims made basis, which means the coverage is good only for the claims that are made during the policy period that they typically indemnify the insured against losses arising out of any claims made for any covered error or omission or a negligent act committed during the conduct of that insured's professional business. So with that as a backdrop, in this report, our focus is on 5 specific professional liability coverages: directors and officers liability, errors and omissions liability, medical professional liability, employment practices liability, and then we also touched on cyber liability. With respect to cyber, there are some E&O policies that include varying, generally small amounts of the same type of coverage that cyber policies provide, but there are some key differences. And because of some of the blurring of those coverages between the cyber policies and the professional liability policies, we in our contacts at PLUS felt it was appropriate to cover cyber liability in our report. Now, in terms of, all right, so how were the lines faring heading into the pandemic? Challenging market dynamics across the vast professional liability landscape had caused AM Best to revise its outlook on the professional liability segment from stable to negative back in March of this year. All right, and so in arriving at that decision, we cited a few specific reasons. We looked at the conditions in the D&O market, which is probably the largest segment premium-wise in terms of the overall professional liability market. Specifically from a D&O perspective, public D&O, those market conditions were clearly hardening after years of depressed rates due to capacity-driven competition that led D&O insurers to suffer, growing underwriting losses in the last few years. The MPL segment, medical professional liability, also carried its own distinct negative outlook heading into 2020. Though that outlook was really tied to rising loss cost trends, diminishing prior year loss reserve redundancies, and depressed demand, and also concerns for rate adequacy. Underwriting results for that line had also been deteriorating. So again, that factored into the negative outlook that AM Best already had on medical professional liability segment coming into 2020. Loss severity for D&O, E&O, and EPL, had already become problematic in recent years due to the rising costs of litigations attributable to social trends, or what's commonly referred to as social inflation. The EPL segment, had been plagued by a notable increase in the number of harassment suits, lawsuits that have been filed. A lot of them probably attributable to the hashtag #MeToo movement. And then looking at it from a cyber risk standpoint and privacy liability, those exposures had been increasing because cyber in general is just an increasingly complex, topic, and those risk characteristics have been making cyber liability, pretty difficult from an underwriting standpoint for underwriters coming into 2020. So when you look at it from that standpoint, those are kind of how those individual 5 lines of coverage were, or professional liability coverage were behaving coming into 2020.
And given the healthcare ramifications, what did respondents say about the MPL line?
So as I mentioned, coming into the year, whether the issue was rate adequacy, rising loss cost trends, MPL insurers were already feeling pressured. All right. Then, with the onset of the pandemic, that led to staff shortages due to the deluge of patients that needed attention during the initial wave of the pandemic. There was also a lack of needed, medical supplies initially that created a heightened level of risk for healthcare professionals to potentially be hit, by a number of lawsuits to the extent that the level of care that they were providing was deemed compromised in some way. The depth of the problems that being faced by healthcare professionals working in long-term care and nursing home facilities was particularly acute. Nursing home and long-term care facilities, those are institutions that had suffered a comparatively large number of COVID-19 deaths, and that led to increased chances that the families of lost loved ones might file suit alleging some sort of inadequate care was being provided.
Now, as you mentioned, David, D&O insurers were already being tested before COVID. What did the survey results show on what's happening since the pandemic surged?
Well, for insurers of, let's say, public company D&O specifically, the issues have only become more complex and potentially hurtful to underwriting results since the pandemic. Public companies had to deal with questions and potential lawsuits that were centered on their response to the pandemic and whether that response was deemed transparent and comprehensive, or as transparent and as comprehensive as it needed to be. Retentions on D&O accounts had already been rising due to escalating cost of defense. So insureds had to raise their retentions, how much they were retaining in terms of those policies coming into this year, and that's probably only going to continue trending upward as we go forward. And that's because the defense costs are only going to continue rising due to COVID-19 claim activity. Both public and private companies have been fighting through the economic downturn that's attributable to the pandemic in order to keep their companies afloat in the current economic environment. And they are having all their actions heavily scrutinized by their customers, their employees, and their shareholders. So to the extent that the market conditions, those market constituents hold corporate managers responsible for the weakened state that some companies find themselves in, lawsuits are emerging that D&O insurers are going to have to defend. And whether those lawsuits go to trial or not, rising legal costs is definitely a reality for D&O insurers.
Sridhar, I want to get you into the conversation here. Given the work from home environment, how has the cyber insurance landscape been impacted?
I think the line has evolved considerably from a E&O policy to a standalone product that incorporates a variety of hazards that it covers. And especially with the work from home environment, hacking techniques have become much more advanced as they combine powerful computer code along with social engineering methods like behavioral dynamics in order to penetrate into networks, computers, and compromise privacy and security of these networks. So clearly, the demand for cyber insurance has increased a lot, and insurers are aware of not just about affirmative cyber losses that they provide, but they're also being really careful about the silent cyber, the cyber hazards that are hidden in different other policies that David spoke about, like maybe in a DNO or a medical malpractice liability kind of insurance. So definitely there's awareness increased. And of course, there's a lot of pressure from regulators like the GDPR, the California Consumer Privacy Act, so on, and other regulations definitely put a lot of pressures on businesses in order to make sure that they protect personally identifiable information and make sure that they have methods in place if those information is compromised. And ransomware, of course, has been a very growing source of consternation across the industry. And the pandemic, as you said, has made the hackers more active. So in terms of the impact of the pandemic per se, cyber ranks a little bit behind employment practices liability, MPL, and DNO in terms of the impact. But definitely, there were comments that that mentioned that cybercrime was on the rise, and healthcare in particular, as an industry, with remote monitoring and other kind of medicines, will lead to ambiguity between product liability, E&O, cyber, and MPL. So there's a lot of risk still out there.
Sridhar, were there any other big takeaways from the survey?
I think the other line that we really didn't talk about that much, John, was the EPL, the Employment Practices Liability. I think that definitely, in terms of the impact of the pandemic, clearly, I think EPL insurers, I think it looks like they have had to feel the higher frequency of claims due to the pandemic, because there have been millions of workers who've been furloughed or had their salaries renegotiated, or work from home arrangements at play. So these definitely are creating a lot of uncertainty in the EPL line because of all these issues. And separate from the pandemic, I think there are a lot of other, David mentioned the hashtag #MeToo movement, and there is increasing awareness of racial injustice, and the Federal Equal Pay Act for that bars discrimination between men and women in terms of pay. So all these issues are definitely rising to the fore, and creating more and more litigation and pressure on EPL insurers.
And John, if I may just add one thing, just from an overarching perspective in terms of takeaways, I think, again, if you look at where we are now, where we have infection rates from the pandemic spiking upward, I think one of the common takeaways from the responses we got is that it's going to take a while for some of these things to continue playing out for all of the different lines of business. But in terms of the claim activity and just how much this is manifesting itself in terms of bottom line impact on MPL insurers and DNO insurers and EPL, et cetera. So I think that's something that we definitely will continue looking into as we go through to 2021. And again, when you look at where we are now in terms of the pandemic, and again, some infection rates spiking up, it just goes to show you that those impacts that were going to manifest themselves over time already, that timeline is already being complicated by the fact that we have the current wave now of spiked infection. So I think everything in terms of how it's going to impact these particular lines from a professional liability standpoint, the time horizon, it's going to take a little bit of time for it to play out in terms of number of claims, and in terms of just the depth of the impact in terms of bottom line operating profitability for insurers of professional liability.
Thanks, David. Sridhar.
You're welcome, John.
That was Sridhar Manyem, Director, Industry Research and Analytics, and David Blades, Associate Director, Industry Research and Analytics, both at AM Best. You can find the full survey results online at ambest.com. For AM Best TV, I'm John Weber.